We're pleased today to have Senator Laura Ebke with us. Senator Ebke represents the 32nd Legislative District, which is just south of Lincoln, and she is the chair of the Nebraska Senate Judiciary Committee. She is also a member of the Education Committee. Dr. Ebke, I might add, graduated from Fairbury High and then went out of state earning a bachelor's and master's at the University of Memphis. We were just chatting, if you follow football, Memphis took out UCLA this weekend, and she was quite excited about that. She returned to Nebraska and in 2005 took her PhD in political science here at UNL. A registered Republican for many years, she recently registered as a member of the Libertarian Party and is thought to be the first member of the Libertarian Party to serve in the Nebraska Unicam. Senator Ebke.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, thanks for inviting me to be here today, Professor. As was mentioned, I have to tell you all that unlike many of the distinguished lecturers that you've had here before me over the last few terms, I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. As a political scientist, I may have a little different take on some of these things than you do, but let's get started. My position as Judiciary Chair may seem a little strange given the fact that I'm not an attorney, although historically there have been a number of Judiciary Committee chairs in the legislature who were not attorneys. It's not required, and I would argue that it's probably a good thing once in a while, even though I have nothing against lawyers, that it might be good to get someone outside of the legal profession to lead and serve on that committee. While the committee is currently made up with 4 people with law degrees, there are also 4 of us from other walks of life, and it's interesting, we sometimes drag the lawyers in the crowd kind of out of their legal ease and say, well, what does this exactly mean? So with that in mind, I want to take you back to January of 2015. And that's right after I'd gotten sworn into the legislature, and I'd asked to serve on the Judiciary Committee. Don't ask me why, but I'll tell you anyhow. My dad is an attorney, and I'd always been fascinated with the law. My sister is an attorney and was nominated to a judicial position. She became a judge the month after, or the month that I was elected to the legislature. And so, and I'd always been interested in the law. I pondered for a while we were in Memphis whether to take my LSAT and go to law school or to go to graduate school. I decided on graduate school and embarked on an adventure that hasn't really paid great financial benefits, but which has really been a good thing from the standpoint of learning and getting to know different people. So anyhow, I asked to be on the committee, and I got that wish. And the first thing that I was told when I was appointed to the committee by Senator Seiler, who was the committee chair at the time, was this. He said, read the LR 424 report. I said, okay, the 424 report, what is that? I had to go find out what a 424 report was. I was brand new to the legislature. I thought I knew something about the way the system worked. And in reality, I had no idea what the 424 report was. So that was the legislature's report from the fall of 2014, which was while I was running for election, which is probably why I had paid absolutely no attention to the 424 report, on a variety of issues, starting with the Nico Jenkins case, but which highlighted a ton of other problems that were found within the corrections system. And then we started hearings. And there was all this talk about justice reinvestment. And I had not a clue what that was either, but had some people who brought in big folders to my office, and they tried to explain it to me. And then there were tons of other criminal justice-related bills that came before the committee, and they continue to come through the committee. The Judiciary Committee is charged with the responsibility for processing legislation in the following areas, which I would argue are related to criminal justice, as well as a bunch of others that I'm not going to mention. But we deal with, first, courts, judges, procedures, rules of evidence, judicial districts, jurisdiction, and juvenile code. That's one thing that we deal with. Second, we deal with criminal code, crimes and punishments and capital punishment and the like. Third, we deal with community corrections. Community corrections is a big deal in Nebraska. It's becoming a bigger deal, and I would argue that it needs to be an even bigger deal than it currently is. Four, law enforcement and the state patrol. That's something that we deal with. Five, criminal procedures and crime victim reparations. We also deal with probation and parole. Number 7, we deal with immigration. Don't ask me why, but that comes to the Judiciary Committee when there's anything that has to do with immigration, so we've seen the DACA bills. And then handgun permits and possession and use of guns. So you can see we deal with a whole wide range of things that touch on criminal justice matters. Now, those are in addition to all of these other civil law things, divorces and custody issues and tort reform and all those kinds of things. But really the last 3 years, most of what we've dealt with, we've had a few garnishment bills and things like that, but most of what we've dealt with has kind of circulated around the whole criminal justice universe. So when one of the first bills that came before me was this really huge Justice Reinvestment Act, LB 605. That sought to change sentencing guidelines for a bunch of different felonies. It included the increased use of probation and supervised release. And it generally was attempting to figure out how we could decrease the numbers in prison. Okay? When that came before the committee, and the bill was about this thick, and it just kept getting thicker. It's funny because we spent, it was a 90-day session. It was introduced on, I don't know, the second or third day of committee hearings. And we didn't actually finally send it out of committee until just about the last possible day that we could in order for it to get onto the floor and be heard. Because we were messing with that for a good chunk of the session, the early days of the session. So I really kind of wondered what I'd gotten myself into, and I wasn't sure whether I could possibly understand everything that had to do with justice reinvestment. And I'm not sure that I still understand it all in every detail, but I have a lot better picture of what's going on and what the goals are. So when the other big bill that came around pretty early in the session was the repeal of the death penalty, it seemed to me like that this was going to be a far more controversial and complex committee than I'd thought it would be when I requested membership on it. Keep in mind that my father, as an attorney, I don't think he ever spent a day in court. He did almost all, so I didn't even think about, Perry Mason and that sort of stuff. I thought that he was going to, I thought that the Judiciary Committee would deal with these grand and glorious notions of constitutional law, and that it would deal with tort reform and, how contracts are written and that sort of stuff. So I had a pretty steep learning curve. I think I got it figured out, though. So there are some rules that I learned over the last few years. Things that, how many of you are criminal justice majors, interested in criminal justice, think you're going to go into some form of criminal justice or law or something? Okay. Whoa. Okay, so here's some things that you need to be looking at. Maybe I'm just going to pull that out of there. That's okay. So here's some things that you should be looking at in your professional life, whether it's in legal studies or criminal justice or whatever. Rule number 1, civil liberties are important. In fact, they're a really big deal, and we should all respect them. Civil liberties and procedures are more than just free speech, though. That is important. But for those of us engaged in criminal justice in some way, whether it's in the making of laws, the enforcement of laws, or the adjudication of laws, it's important to keep in mind those crazy 4th through 8th Amendments to the Constitution as well. Okay, search warrants in the Fourth Amendment, and processes for issuing and serving them. Electronic requests. We've had we've kind of entered into a new era where law enforcement now can request warrants online, and judges can issue them online. I was down in Texas a couple of years ago, right after my sister had, maybe a year after my sister had been appointed judge, and the local sheriff was asking for, or police department was asking for a warrant for something. I don't even know what it was. And we were in this hotel room, and she's reading through their request for the warrant, and then she signs it digitally and sends it back all on her phone. That's a new world that we're in. Is it good or bad? I don't know. But it is what we have to deal with. And as a legislature and as practitioners, we need to be sure that we're not abusing the electronic media that way as we issue warrants, as we create new ways of proceedings. Capital punishment and due process in the Fifth Amendment. Obviously, the death penalty bill and questions surrounding capital punishment came to the Judiciary Committee. But one of the things that we seem to see vast differences of opinion on is what due process really is. And depending on who you are, what your political outlook is, what your point of view about civil liberties generally is, what your view about crime and punishment is, you see due process from a very different perspective. And of course, there are all these other issues related to civil liberties as well. Now, it's important to remember that law enforcement is acting on behalf of the state, and that the Bill of Rights, Amendments 1 through 10, this is the political scientist in me, was designed specifically to protect the people from state abuse. Okay? So that would suggest that it's important for the state to watch itself. And I can tell you that I believe that, that most of the controversial issues that we deal with respect to law enforcement procedures would be alleviated if we could just all agree that civil liberties in criminal cases are important. Okay, rule number 2. Sometimes bad things happen and people forget about civil liberties in criminal cases. Okay? One of the biggest concerns that I have where law enforcement is concerned, and corrections as well, is this. Working with bad guys is dangerous work. Arresting bad guys is dangerous. So how do we keep the good guys safe and ensure that the bad guys, or the alleged bad guys, have their rights protected while securing them or making arrests? Now, we've all seen examples with the advent of the dashboard cameras and the body cameras of law enforcement occasionally pushing things further than some would like. We've also seen examples, I have anyhow, of citizens in their role as sort of citizen activists who push law enforcement further than they probably should unnecessarily. Cameras are good, and they provide a level of protection for both sides. They protect against false claims of abuse, and they also protect as proof of abuse. The problem of protecting civil liberties and arrests, though, and for those while incarcerated, is probably not going to go away. Technology continues on, and there's always going to be sort of a he said, she said, and there's always going to be sort of a question of whether or not there's some sort of manipulation of the digital record. So we got to pay close attention to those things, and I would argue we need to err on the side of protecting civil liberties. Rule number 3, prosecutors, anybody want to be an attorney? Okay, you want to be a prosecutor? Uh-oh, okay. That's okay. My sister was a prosecutor, and I love her. Prosecutors want us to be tough on crime. That's the thing that they do, right? Defenders, the defense attorneys, anybody want to be a defense attorney? Yeah, public defender or something? Defenders want us to believe that all of their defendants are being abused by the system. And it's sometimes hard to come up with a happy middle ground. Historically, there have been a number of law and order or tough on crime periods of time in my lifetime. In the late 60s and early 70s, during the Vietnam War and the associated protests, there was a real desire to get tough on crime. And I am old enough, barely, but I can remember those days. I can remember watching the news with Walter Cronkite, with my dad, while the Vietnam War protests were raging. I can remember those. And I can remember that my dad, who is a very libertarian-leaning Republican, okay, was concerned about the law and order issue. I mean, that there are certain things that happen in society that, that tend to spur sort of this law and order mentality. So I can remember all of those protests in the streets and the hippies sleeping naked in the parks, and of course some of the more violent civil rights events. And I remember also, again, just barely. But I remember also, and this may be just my political historian thing coming out, sometimes I have trouble distinguishing between what I actually remember and what I remember because I've seen it so many other times. But I remember that President Nixon, he promised to get tough on crime. That was one of his key platforms, get tough on crime. He was going to clean up the streets. And those who opposed some of those law and order efforts were seen as being what? Soft on crime, sympathetic to criminals, communists. I mean, you had all sorts of things being said, right? And even though most of them were really only suggesting that there were civil liberties which the state must observe and which were seemingly being brushed aside pretty casually by sort of the ruling element of the time. So then you fast forward to the 80s and the Reagan-era movement, and this wasn't just in the Reagan era, but certainly the Reagan era kind of started it in the Bush 1 era, a move towards the three strikes laws, even into the 90s. Three strikes, habitual criminal laws, and so forth, and the mandatory minimum sentences. This happened at both the federal and the state level, and I would just note that Nebraska has a fair number of these laws on the books. The habitual criminal laws have the effect of tacking on time to sentences far in excess of what the sentences would be for the actual offense, up to and including life in prison. Suggestions, however, that we should get rid of habitual criminal laws have been met with great opposition by prosecutors. Nobody wants to get rid of the habitual criminal statutes. Sometimes they don't even use it, okay? But they threaten it. If you don't confess to a particular crime, if you don't, they're going to try you, and you're going to get stuck with a habitual criminal designation, and then you'll end up in prison. So that's something to watch for. When you're a prosecutor, be careful of that, okay? It's okay to be a prosecutor. We need prosecutors, but we need to make sure that we aren't, that we've got a level of rationality and that we are thinking through some of these things. It's fair, I think, to understand why prosecutors think this way. They live in their own silo as prosecutors, okay? That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to prosecute people and put them in jail on behalf of the state, right? But that's why we have a legislative branch that's separate from the executive branch. When the executors get to make the rules, they are more likely to make rules that they like, that fulfill the function that they think that they're supposed to fulfill. And so it's important, I think, for the legislative branch to have some oversight on these issues and to maintain a level of control and watchdoggedness, maybe, I don't know. Mandatory minimums is another one of those things that causes great consternation. The mandatory minimum for a Class 1D felony in Nebraska, which is typically a drug felony, oftentimes with firearm possession, not necessarily use of a firearm, but firearm possession, or a 1C felony, is either a minimum, in the 1D instance, a 3 to 50-year sentence, and in the 1C example, 5 to 50 years. Okay? Now, why do we need mandatory minimums of 3 years or 5 years when a judge could give the convicted person 50 years if they want to. If those are truly awful people, give them the 50 years, okay? Chances are the ones who are getting 3 years or 5 years are first-time offenders, or their case was in some other way unique, and the judge had no choice. They didn't necessarily want to, to give them that much, but because of the nature of the crime, the charge, they had to give them the mandatory minimum. Okay. If they are somehow unique, or if this is a first-time offense, why? Is that really the most productive way of ensuring that we don't have people returning to prison time after time after time? There are a number of us who believe that for nonviolent drug felonies, especially, we should get rid of mandatory minimums altogether and leave sentencing to the judge's discretion. Most of our trial court judges in Nebraska are former prosecutors, okay? So they're not likely to really be soft on crime. They're likely to use good sense and leave somebody in longer if they need to be. Now, getting rid of mandatory minimums is one way that we could chip away at our prison crowding problem. It wouldn't make a huge difference, but it would make steps in the right direction, I think. And it would put sentencing more squarely in the hands of judges, who I think are best equipped to know the details of each case rather than in the hands of the legislature, which isn't really well equipped to deal with the intricacies of the case. Rule 4, prison is not a fun place to work or live, and it's even less fun when it's overcrowded or understaffed. When my time in the legislature is finished, whether that's at the end of this term or whether I get reelected and have another term, I suspect the thing that I will remember most vividly is the time that I've dedicated to trying to understand our corrections issues. For context, Nebraska has 10 correctional facilities under the umbrella of the Department of Corrections. 7 of those would be considered medium to high-level security facilities. Tecumseh, the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln, the Lincoln Correctional Center, the Omaha Correctional Center, the Women's Correctional Center in York, the Youth Correctional Center in Omaha for young people sentenced in adult court who were under the age of 19 when sentenced. Many of those will be moved to one of the adult facilities when they reach 21 in some months. I don't remember what it is. And then the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center, which is the intake facility for all males who have been sent to the custody of the Department of Corrections. Now, of those facilities, 3 are running populations of less than 140% of design capacity. Design capacity means that if the cells were designed to hold 1 or 2 bunks, that's how the capacity is calculated. So if you have 100 cells with a design capacity, they were designed to hold 2 bunks each, okay, you've got a design capacity of 200. If you're at 140% of design capacity, you've got 280 people in an area that was designed for 200. Still kind of crowded, but probably doable, right? A couple of these prisons are closer to 200%, and one was up to over 300% a few weeks ago, hopefully for a short period of time. Now, use that 140% number because it's a number that comes up frequently when you're talking about court cases. As sort of the number that federal courts expect that you operate below, okay? Before they'll step in if you get too high if a lawsuit is filed. Now, Nebraska has had a lawsuit filed against it because our corrections system as a whole is operating at, depending on the day and the week, at around 160% of capacity. That's not strictly, it's not strictly that numbers, the numbers that are the problem. The real problem and the basis of the lawsuit, though, is that when you're operating that far above the design capacity, you don't have the space to ensure the safety of inmates from other inmates and you don't have the space or personnel to provide the necessary programming, behavioral and mental health treatment, so for instance, or vocational training, that the inmates need before they're going to be eligible for parole. Anybody here want to be a parole or probation officer? There's going to be a lot of, that's okay. There's going to be a lot of demand for parole and probation officers over the next 10 years, I think, in Nebraska. The argument goes that the civil, that for instance, in the lawsuit that was filed by the ACLU, the argument goes that the civil liberties of inmates are violated more with overcrowding, that prisons are a more dangerous place for both inmates and staff when there is significant overcrowding, okay? And I think that experience largely proves that to be the case. So examples of some of the problems that we have. Boats. Anybody know what boats are in the prison context? Boats are what they refer to at the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center, these little portable cots, basically. They're stackable. I don't know how to explain them exactly. They're like, they're almost like the carry-out containers, but they're plastic, and you stack them, okay, at the end of the night under a stairwell, okay? And they have mattresses stacked as well. So when it's time for everybody to go to bed, okay, they pull these boats out and they put the mattress pads out, and that's where the inmates sleep at night. Not even behind locked doors, not even in their own cell. They don't have their own bed. They don't have their own locker to put things that's not out in the open. And so why would that be a dangerous thing? Why would that be a bad thing? I mean, it's prison, right? It's supposed to be a bad place. It's not supposed to be fun. Well, the problem is that it makes things a lot more dangerous. You have people who aren't contained, who aren't in their cells at night. They're just, you may have, 20 or 25 prisoners just laying out in the commons area, okay? That makes it more dangerous for the lower level staff. There's a lower number of staff on duty at night. It makes it more dangerous for them. It also increases the chances when people are in that close of proximity at night, and if somebody starts snoring or something, they start whacking each other. I mean, this sounds silly, but if you're in a contained area and somebody starts really irritating you, when you're in and you've got a population that may be prone to outbursts anyway, you have the potential for some bad things to happen. Okay, so that's one of the problems we've got, and that's one of the issues that's been identified as a problem. You have cells with 4 bunks that were designed for 3 bunks, or for 2 bunks rather. Okay, now have any of you done a tour through any of the prisons? The prison cells typically aren't that big anyway. I mean, there's not just a lot of space to move around. Okay, so imagine in one of the cells where it was designed for 2, or 1 in some cases, that you've doubled the number of people in there. Okay, 1 toilet, 1 sink, 4 bunks, in an area that is about half the size of my college dorm room back in 1981. It's pretty scary when you think about it, especially when you consider the people that are there. And they don't get to walk out and go down the hall to the bathroom. They don't get to walk out and go down to the vending machine, or they don't get to walk out and go down to the commons area to watch TV. They're there. So that has some potential for problems. Hooch. Everybody know what hooch is? Hooch is basically an alcohol product that I'll talk about in a little more detail. Well, not a lot, but a little more detail here in a few minutes, I guess. But hooch is another problem, because when you bring hooch or drugs into the environment, then you add another complication to what's going on. We've had fires. Okay, in the system. We know that the so-called Mother's Day riot down at Tecumseh in 2015 included fires as well as 2 deaths. And we've had a lot more staff assaults lately that have been reported. Now, so far, we haven't had any really serious staff assaults, but nevertheless, it depends on how you define serious, I guess. So how do we address those problems effectively? And therein lies the problem. As long as we can't send people out faster than they're coming in, we've got a real problem. We've started to reduce intakes, but not adequately. And the parole board and the post-release supervision has taken on more of a load on the output side of things. But so far, our efforts at justice reinvestment haven't paid off the way that we'd hoped that they would. And we're hoping yet that it will take a dive here pretty soon. There are examples where one state, Pennsylvania, for instance, introduced a system pretty similar to ours, and they didn't follow the model the way that they thought it would work, but they did eventually. 18 months beyond where they thought they were going to start see drops. So we're hopeful that we'll still see some of that. The other problem that we have, though, in addition to overcrowding, is understaffing. So filling all the positions in corrections that we have is challenging. It's virtually impossible in a job market like we've got in Nebraska with very low unemployment. So what we have happening in some of these facilities is this. There are X number of posts that have to be staffed during each shift. And those posts that are being staffed for the most part. But the problem is they're not being staffed by unique individuals that work every day from 9 to 5 or whatever the shift is, but rather by people who are working overtime hours. They work their post for 8 hours, their regular post for 8 hours, and they go work another post for 4 hours or 8 hours. In Tecumseh, we have people working routinely. They're scheduled for 12-hour shifts, and then they have mandatory overtime in addition to that. Now imagine what happens to your state of mind if you're working 12 to 16-hour days, 4 days a week or more. Okay, not just once in a while. I mean, we've all worked someplace probably where, somebody calls in sick and you end up working a double shift, but then, you go back to your regular schedule. You're not working that double shift every day in perpetuity. What happens, though, to your patients with those that you work around? In the case of a correctional facility, are you more likely to be on edge or to roll with some of the things that are likely to be going on the inside in an institution like that? And I think it's safe to assume that not only does overcrowding make things potentially more dangerous for both inmates and staff, but understaffing does the same thing. Some would say that to fix the overstaffing and overcrowding problems, we should build more prisons. Okay, that's one solution, albeit probably a $500 billion solution, which will not come easily at this time of relative austerity in the state government and revenue. And of course, there's another problem. If we build a facility that would house, say, 500 inmates and would change the dynamics of overcrowding across the system, how do we staff it? Will a new facility be a more appealing place for people to work? Will it bring hundreds of new employees into the corrections system? I'm kind of skeptical about that. I'm not convinced that we get there. And there are, of course, 3 other correctional facilities in the system. The Work Ethic Camp in McCook, the Community Corrections Centers, one in Lincoln and one in Omaha. And these facilities are lower security, and many of the inmates have had the opportunity to work off campus or on work release kind of programs. And I've come to believe that for those who are nonviolent criminals, or who have served the bulk of their sentence and shown signs of rehabilitation, that our community corrections programs are a great opportunity and perhaps the most efficient way for us to manage nonviolent offenders. I hope we can come up with new ways of looking at community corrections and get more people out of the traditional facilities and into work environments and training that might help them to be successful in their post-release life and avoid recidivating. Folks on work release who have an increased level of control over their own lives have a tendency to do their time with few altercations or difficulties working and playing well with others. We've walked through, as I said, we've walked through all 10 of the facilities this summer. And walking through the community corrections was no big deal. I mean, you don't have the big walls, you don't have the barbed wire, you don't have nearly the kind of security rules. And you know, when you drive up, there are inmates that are wandering around cleaning things up and mowing the grass and things like that. If you have a level of liberty, if you will, even while being incarcerated, it's probably a good deal, and it will certainly help people to re-enter kind of free society later. Rule number 5. See, I'm getting back to the rules. Rule number 5, special oversight committees can be a lot of work and take a lot of time. And I've talked about these a little bit already, but the legislature has 2 types of special committees, at least 2 that I've run into so far. We have special oversight committees and special investigatory committees. Now, the reality is that those 2 types of special committees can have many of the same functions, but the distinguishing difference seems to be that an investigatory committee has the power, if necessary, to issue subpoenas. The LR 424 committee back in 2014, the Nico Jenkins case committee was an investigatory committee, and I believe that they did issue subpoenas, including, I think, to the governor. LR 34 committee, which looked into issues related to corrections in 2015 and 2016, was an investigatory committee, although it did not issue subpoenas, but rather invited testimony and requested information, and for the most part, we got it. This past session, the legislature created the Nebraska Justice System Special Oversight Committee. I get to chair that committee. And the other 6 committee members that were appointed are all members who have not served on the Judiciary Committee. I would argue that this has been a real learning experience for them as we've traveled around the state, seen our different correctional system facilities, and also as they've learned more about probation and parole and the real challenges that we're facing. We've taken these tours, engaged on sort of a fact-finding mission. Our visits typically consist of meeting with staff as well as inmates. Inmates around the table with us have included people in prison for virtually any crime for which you can be imprisoned: assault, homicide, burglary, and in one case, one person who's on death row. I have found that the inmates that we've met with have been well-spoken, understand that for many of them, they'll be spending the rest of their lives in prison, and really just want to be safe and have something to do. Keep in mind that the state, when it takes away somebody's liberty through incarceration, has an obligation to protect and care for them. Now, we visited Tecumseh back in June and saw some of the changes that have been made since the Mother's Day riot in 2015. There was another disturbance that occurred in March of this year. Both of those resulted in the deaths of 2 inmates. To date, we haven't had any serious injuries, depending on how you define serious, I suppose, injuries or deaths among correctional staff, but I think it's safe to assume that the threat hangs over the heads of staff and may be a partial explanation for why it's difficult to attract and keep staff. Tecumseh is also on a 12-hour workdays, which I've mentioned already, and they work 4 days a week rather than 8 hours, but they've also had to institute that mandatory overtime. We also visited the Nebraska State Penitentiary, and of all the prisons, Nebraska State Penitentiary and Tecumseh certainly fight these battles with contraband. And I don't think I really fully understood how serious of an issue that was until I started walking through the halls and people started explaining this to me. Contraband includes illegal drugs, it includes alcohol, it includes weapons, and it even includes cell phones. So how does this contraband get into the prison? You know, you'd think big walls, razor wire, they run you through a metal detector and all this sort of stuff. They pat people down. Well, how does it get there? We don't know. Perhaps through staff on occasion. In some instances, through visitors who manage to get it around the screening processes somehow. In the case of alcohol, we're talking about this hooch that I mentioned. And it's a home brew of sorts. It's something that the inmates concoct using a variety of things, but fruit, bread, water, anything else that might ferment is put together and hidden in foot lockers and trash cans and places like that. For most of us, even college students who often don't have very discriminating tastes where alcohol is concerned, aside from whether it's cheap, I guess, right? Drinking that brew would probably not be all that appealing for most of us. And I guess if that's all you can get, that's what you get. But it causes real problems because nobody knows how much alcohol is in it. It might be very potent. It might, there's all sorts of issues related to that. We also went out to the work ethic camp and the women's prison in York. The work ethic camp was designed to be a transitional facility, one where inmates who were deemed to be at lower risk could be getting ready for transitioning out of incarceration or get some work experience. The problem with both York and the McCook facility is that it's, where does most of the crime in Nebraska happen? Happens in Omaha and Lincoln. I mean, the raw numbers would suggest that, I think. It's certainly the things that people are incarcerated for. If you go in and talk to people from prison, you ask them where they're from. Omaha, Omaha, Omaha. Lincoln, Omaha, 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 Lincoln. Then sometimes you get Gretna or something. So you get an odd community in there. That's not to say that crime isn't being committed in other places or that people, but just the raw numbers would suggest, I think, that most are from Omaha and Lincoln. And the problem with both McCook and York is that they're a long ways from Omaha and Lincoln. It makes it tough for inmates who may not be there for an extended period of time, to maintain those connections with family and friends. It makes it tough for those with families to, kids especially, to come in and maintain some sort of a relationship as well. We visited the 3 Omaha facilities plus the probation reporting station in Omaha in 2 days of visits. Probably the most interesting thing for me during that swing was the youth correctional facility. I guess I didn't really know that we had that. I mean, I guess on paper I knew, but I wasn't really familiar with what it was. In my district we have the YRTC Geneva, and I kept thinking, oh, that's what that is. It's just another one in Omaha. No, it's not. The people that are in the Omaha Youth Correctional Facility are folks under the age of 18 at the time of their sentencing who were tried as adults in criminal court. Okay, so they may be murderers. Who were under the age of 18, and they were sentenced to the youth correctional facility, and they will stay there until they're 21 and some odd number, and then go into the regular facility. So you don't think about this until somebody tells you, though, these are guys that did this, and this. It's like, oh, okay. So it's not a reformatory school. It's an adult. It's a facility for adult crimes for people who are younger. So that's the least crowded of our facilities right now, something around 50%, I think, right now, so, which is a good thing. Okay, so the LR 127 has completed its grand tour of corrections. We met with folks from both parole and probation, and we'll be having hearings on October 20th. Feel free to come if you want to get some answers to questions that came up over the course of our tours, and then we'll continue to watch and reassess where the process is going and what we might be able to do legislatively in order to fix some of these problems that we've got, or if there is anything we can do to fix it. So, finally, rule number 6. Know that while you have a lot of things you could talk about, people might be interested in talking about something else. So leave some time for questions. That's my rule. So what questions do you have? And I'll take questions with respect to corrections or criminal justice process. Generally, if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you that. If you want to know something about the Judiciary Committee, just let me know.
You can use the mic there, or I'll hand it out here.
So I know one of the issues the Judiciary Committee is looking at is aging inmates as part of the potential for overcrowding. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and what you guys are thinking about doing and part of that process?
Sure. We have an interim study that we just had a hearing on the other day regarding compassionate release for the aged and infirm. And I don't think we came to any clear consensus. There's sort of a mixed feelings about that. You know, I was down in Tecumseh and visited their healthcare area, their hospital area, and I was surprised at the number of people that we have in there who are, in any other situation, would be in a nursing home. And the question is, you know, somebody says, well, would it save money if we, you know, got rid of them in the prisons? Well, no, not really, because we'd still have to pay for their care because they would be Medicaid eligible and they would go into long-term care. But compassionate release of types like that, especially for those who are terminally ill or who are very old, you know, the potential for sending them out into a long-term care facility. They don't need a lot of watching. They need health care. They don't need security. Would give them the possibility, at least, of being able to spend time with family on a little more intimate level, if they've got any family left. That they would be able to do that. I don't know if we're going to have a time for a bill this year. I mean, I think that's something that we keep considering, but you know, this is a 60-day session coming up, and we got a lot of things on the table already. I'm not sure we get to that, but there are a number of us who are looking pretty seriously at that.
Whoa, very careful.
I've got lots of questions, but it'd be interesting to hear what in the Inspector General's report that just came out, what you saw as the most positive and negative things. For me, when we talk about the staffing issues and we don't have increases for longevity, that's always my number one thing. Is you could take the best business people in Omaha and Lincoln and say, hire employees even for a fun job, more fun than being a correctional officer, but you will somebody you're on the job 10 years, somebody that gets hired this morning will get the exact same pay. It's just a horrible HR practice.
I agree. When I was on a school board for 12 years before I came to the legislature, and when they started talking about this scheme for paying correctional officers, and I guess other state employees, I'm not entirely sure, but I know correctional officers, without any kind of step increases, experience pay, whatever. I thought, well, why would they ever do that? You know, I mean, in the world of public schools, you get increases, you know, based on time in service. You know, the first couple of years, I think it's every year, depending on the structure of the contract. But you get pay increases based on years of experience and then added education. So, you know, there's lots of ways to get additional pay. I don't know why they set it up that way. Unfortunately, there's a limit to what the legislature can do in that regard. Well, we can recommend strongly, but the administration, you know, we appropriate the money. The administration negotiates all of the contracts. I don't know, frankly, I don't know why the union hasn't insisted upon it, but that's just me. Can't say that there's anything that stood out because I've talked to Doug so many times that everything, you know, everything seems pretty to sort of blend together. Certainly, you know, we've still got our challenges. I mean, I think that the director has a vision for where he'd like to see things going. You know, personally, I think that I told him one day, I said, I think if you could have 6 months with no big issues coming up, that we might be able to turn the corner. He says, oh, 6 months would be heaven. I think, it's just one of those things that every time we start seeing some positive move in the right, in the right direction, then something, kind of pushes us back, whether it's an inmate disturbance or a series of staff assaults or whatever. So hopefully we'll have some quiet time here the next few months.
I was going to ask, what are some of the things that you see coming up or coming to the legislature this year, specifically the judiciary?
Well, we have a number of bills that are on the floor yet that I think will probably get a little bit of life for a little while at least. I mean, our mandatory minimum bill is still out there. That was Senator Chambers' bill that it was amended by Senator Linehan to change the bill pretty significantly. I think, but that came through Judiciary. I think that'll be a big thing. I haven't heard too many rumblings out there. I mean, we have a few. Senator Pansing Brooks had some concern about youth visits of parents and of parents who are incarcerated. I would suspect that we'll see something from her. I don't know that, but that would be my guess. I mean, we had an interim study on that the other day. We may see something. Somebody may decide to do something with the compassionate release. I don't think anybody's made a decision on that for sure yet. That's kind of what I'm hearing, but who knows? We may just get. In my little world, I kind of hope for lots of garnishment bills because they're really boring, and we don't have to have these battles. Anything else?
I'll speak loud in my teacher voice.
Okay.
Okay, there we go on tape. I was curious more from the selfish academic perspective within the school. When you had an opportunity to speak and meet with staff in the various correctional facilities, obviously staff are feeling, the environment, the things that have been happening are challenges and so forth. They're working long shifts, so they may or may not feel supported in the global sense. But I'm wondering more so with this up and coming generation of students in workforce development, if you got the sense that staff felt that they were adequately prepared with the skills, and I'm not talking about defensive tactics and things like that, but was there anything mentioned about things that perhaps the university and other entities could be contributing to enhance the correctional workforce, to make that an attractive career track for young professionals?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of talk about that specifically in terms of kind of the workforce development issue. There's just a big concern about workforce, and whether and having enough people. Now, I think there is a recognition. I mean, there's a difference between people of my generation, I'm 55 and older, and the way that they see, the job, and the people that, who are, roughly speaking, millennials see the job, my kids' age, the way they see their work life. You have a different set of priorities. You have sort of a different set of loyalties. I was talking to somebody the other day who's now my new legal counsel, and his comment was, yeah, we probably aren't going to have very many gold watchers anymore. This idea that somebody gets a career, with either the state or with a private organization and then just stays there, because that's sort of the generational change. And I think that there's a frustration, probably by the older staff, with the newer folks that come in who, they work it for a while and then something better comes along and they leave. And I can't blame them for doing that, especially given the nature of the work, but I think it's frustrating because, and it adds to the frustration of those who are more experienced because they just keep training people over and over again without having anybody that really steps into, or not very many that will step into new leadership roles as the next generation.
I've got one for you while we're thinking. I'm interested in the death penalty. Do you see the legislature addressing that again, perhaps abolishing, as you folks did a couple years ago?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Senator Chambers continues to introduce the bill. It was introduced last year, and it's sitting in committee. I think after the vote by the people, I think there's sort of a recognition, even amongst those who oppose the death penalty in principle, that it's not going anywhere. You know, from a legislative standpoint, we may have to depend upon the Supreme Court or just the practice. I mean, you know, it's been 20 years since we've put anybody to death in Nebraska almost, and so I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's in that it's. I don't think it's an imminent danger of coming off the books, but I'm not sure that it's an imminent danger of actually being used either.
How do we maintain justice reinvestment without external grant funding, external technical assistance, internal funding for it, and statutory requirements for agencies to turn over data?
It's a really good question. We've been asking that question a lot in my office lately. I chair the JROC committee, the legislature's Justice Reinvestment Oversight Committee. And we've been struggling with that. You know, how do we make sure that we stay on board? And it's gonna require all three branches of government to continue a dialogue and to continue to try to struggle with some of these issues and you know, come to some sort of an agreement. Whether that's possible in today's political environment, I don't know. So I don't know. I wish I could say, yeah, we've got it covered. I don't know if we do.
I think with that, it's 1 o'clock. We have classes starting, and we have some goodies across the hallway. Thank you, Senator Ebke, for taking your time to come visit with us today.
Thanks for having me.